¡Hola, Macarena! Macarena!
Macarena tiene un novio que se llama de vino mi que vino, y la escuela de bandera del muchacho se lleva para también. Macarena tiene un novio que se llama.
Okay, so the way that this thing works, all the way up top, yeah, it's from top to bottom, of course. So all the way up top, we have like the endgame pivot, and we're gonna look at two things. We're gonna just have some kind of overview of all of the core concepts that we need to understand, and then here we're gonna look at implementation. But for now, let's just consider this like a line. Let's not look at this. Let's first look at the concepts. These are like the core concepts that you need to individually understand in order to understand what Endgame is about and how it's going to work. So this is an overview that Retro made, so maybe you can just walk us through it. And the question for you all is, let's see if we think that makes sense as some kind of high-level overview, or if there's anything that we want to change. For example, is there anything missing, or is there anything you want to reframe? Yeah, that's what we should do first. So iterate on what we have here. Retro, can you walk us through?
Love to. So today, everybody I think is fairly familiar with the core unit model and how the core relates, the MIT framework sort of enables everything. And what Endgame is really doing at the most simplistic level is just blowing that up and creating a couple different layers with more well-defined links between the workforce and the key concepts that enable any organization, whether it's a DAO or a more traditional org. What we have here in the purple, the pink, is more of the core-related concepts, and that really just boils down to the scopes. So the scopes are the strategy layer, as I like to call it. The DVCs and councils, tribunals, this is just more of the team or the workforce responsible for improving and defining the strategy layer. As we continue to move down this flowchart, we then have the MakerDAOs, which is the actual workforce that is doing the implementation of the strategy layer. And then the governor concept and the administrative part of the decentralized workforce is separated from the people doing the work and making the decisions. And what this really represents here again is the black box that I think is more traditionally known of the core units, which is both a pro and a con in the decentralized workforce. But I'll pause here. Like, it looks way too simple compared to the months of narratives that we've been hearing, but this is really it. So one more time again, it's the strategy, which is defined through frameworks, the DVCs, councils, and tribunals, which defines the frameworks that then enables the decentralized workforce to operate in a consistent manner.
What's the relationship between scopes and frameworks?
Scopes is the overall concept of breaking up the strategy of an organization into those 12 different boxes. They're then separated into 3 different swim lanes. Primary receives the majority, or should receive the majority, of the capital expenditures to create the revenue and create the product, where secondary and tertiary scopes are more about working on the organization. So something that we proposed back with Juan and the project-based budgeting concept was, how much are we spending on the DAO and how much are we spending on the product that the DAO manages? That's really what the scopes are. And then the frameworks make that strategy actionable, repeatable in a consistent manner. So when we discover like a failure, an instance of an opportunity to improve, that gets passed and documented in the framework. So then we're not talking about a Monetalis deal or a Coinbase deal. We're talking about the overall framework that defines a real-world asset strategy or decentralized collateral strategy.
So a scope would have multiple frameworks.
Correct.
So framework is like the recipe to work something out, and the scope is the defined field of work. So
it's strategy and tactical, or?
So scope includes the people, and a framework is the playbook.
Ah, okay.
it's like the recipe for. Another thing that I like to do, but it's a bit, it's not almost literal, but it's like buyers and sellers. So these are the people that actually say we want to buy something, and these are the people producing the work. So that's a bit how it works.
Yeah, okay, so that's another separation here,
Yeah.
but that doesn't relate to scope
I'm
versus
overly
framework.
simplifying it, but that's a bit like how,
Yeah, yeah.
like a mental model. And the frameworks are super important to the point that, let's say, I don't know, a protector DAO is like, we want to bring in this collateral type or this real world asset. If you want to reject it as a tribunal, you cannot say no because we said no. So it's not like we vote no and screw you, we'll talk in a year. You need to go back and modify the framework. So the recipe or the modus operandi is in its correct form. So the frameworks are super important. They become like a central piece of the Endgame Plan, because you need the framework to be up to date so that it almost runs on
Complexity
its own.
comes in through the different phases too, right? So right now we're in the like early game or pre-game.
Yeah.
Pre-game. And the initial step is going to be the early game, and that's when the front ends are launched and we really start to see the metanomics kick in. The concept of a core unit right now I think is best represented between PE and risk. So those will remain the workforce of the core for the time being, but the overall intent is to have them continue to decentralize into the clusters.
I don't think so. I think like the idea is to ossify the protocol in a way that they just disappear, because there's you don't need to execute anything else. Everything is done.
Well, we have PE and risk in the room, so what messaging have you been receiving? Because again, throughout the retreat, I guess we've been hearing different things.
PE has left
There's a lot of stuff
Yeah,
that
exactly.
wants done, and if he wants it done, it's he can't get rid of us right away, you know.
Yeah.
No, but like in the absolute end state, the ossified final state, in like 50 years, there's no core units there anymore, right?
Exactly.
I think that would be ideal, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm just talking hypotheticals here, right?
Yeah.
I
So
don't think it's hard to see more than a few years, you know.
Yeah.
Those, like, I think you could certainly see a world where at least things are much more automated, and so maybe you need less core staff. Right now, we're a very, very long way away from being able to just walk away.
So I think it's appropriate to highlight then that core units will remain probably for the majority of our time collectively at the DAO. But the intent is, I believe, to continue to remove that and remove that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
push
but
it towards
it's
the
not
workforce
because
layer.
you're like taking core units into MakerDAOs. It's just that the core will evolve at that point that you don't need
So
people there.
most core units will come down here, Nadia.
To the
So
ecosystem.
I think PE goes here, and it's like, let's forget about PE, they will work on the software. Risk kind
No,
of
but
like
it's
fall into here as experts,
On the primary,
and core units are here.
yeah, but still in the primary scope, there is PE, risk, real world assets, and growth.
Yeah.
And I know because I
But
part
as
of that scope.
experts, not as a core unit.
No, it's a core unit.
But the question is, how is that important to our understanding of the Endgame Plan?
But that's part of the terminology confusion too, because governor DAOs have core units, like that's what these clusters turn into. And like only governor DAOs have core units in the terms of like a team. So like there's an admin team and a contributor team for protectors and creators.
And
A core unit will have,
the core
governors
units
will have
that are in
core
those scopes, they convert into the council.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as experts, that's what I'm saying.
Into the council that can execute,
Yes.
What's executed?
That was my understanding as well.
that can like do work, because tribunals, they cannot do anything.
Yeah. They can
But
only define
councils,
projects and
yes.
allocate budgets.
Councils, they can execute work.
I think ultimately the idea is still no. Ultimately, the idea is that the councils are setting what work should be done.
Through frameworks.
And then it gets farmed out to ecosystem actors and the
Yes.
MetaDAOs on who actually executes the work.
Yes.
And like I said, for the short term, like your understanding is the same as mine. But like, as soon as early game potentially, like I could see growth being one of the first ones that would dissolve or like assimilate into this new core unit concept, which is a part of a governor MetaDAO.
Sorry, is it a good time if you can to break down the 3 different entities there, or maybe 4, like DVCs, councils, tribunals, and going on.
She read up the scopes thing, I found that was really helpful.
What's that, sorry?
The scopes, the 12
Oh,
scopes.
Yeah,
They break them out and show
I think
what
that's a
it
good
is.
idea.
Maybe let's put them here on the side. Or
Yeah,
something.
let's do that. Is there someone who
I can
feels
do
like writing them down? Okay.
Thank you, Cruz.
What I will suggest though, let's not try to break down each of these concepts, because the goal of this exercise is not to explain all of them, it's to just create a map of what are the concepts, what are the moving parts that we need to have on our map.
At least initially, like we have plenty of time today to dive into the details.
Yeah, exactly.
But to answer today's question, just very, very briefly, DVCs as we know them today will evolve. Today, the best representation of a DVC is the Wednesday or the Thursday call. It's led by an independent MKR holder, who right now is Rune, and it's made up of a collection of delegates who then have some party affiliations or some defined perspective of how the protocol should go forward. And then that's how a larger group of MKR holders will be encouraged to delegate their votes to specific people and parties or strategies, which are represented by the scopes.
And the frameworks can change every, what, 3 months, 6 months?
There's quarterly meetings where the DVCs will then ask the experts to join to have more concrete conversations about specific improvements to the frameworks, and they could also pull in external experts as well. But yeah, the cadence around frameworks being updated is mainly as needed. So there'll be rapid iterations initially, and then distill down more into that quarterly timeline.
So the main question now is there anything that you maybe want to change or add to this map? Is there anything that you feel like is missing in terms of the big concepts that we need to capture?
Or more questions for clarity too. This isn't meant to be another Rune Radio Light. Like, let's really make this engaging and drill in until everybody's on the same page here.
Delegates?
Those are DVCs now?
Yeah, DVCs.
Yeah, so
We should have them separately, because there is a separation there.
A question: are we talking about the end game itself, or this is? Because I understand this is not that well applicable to pre-game, because there's a lot of things that will be overlapping, like the current structure that we have right now, and then this will get spun out. But I'm guessing like this is a picture for the actual end game, right?
So
like, it's like what Juan was saying, it's like transition and end state. We're looking at end state.
This is end state.
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
correct. Yeah.
And pregame is probably better appreciated as that transitionary period.
Yeah.
So in the short term, some of the things that we're going to start enacting is making the communities for the MetaDAOs to prepare them to onboard clusters, but also refining the DVCs into their final structure. So that'll be happening a lot sooner, where the DVC calls as you know it, over the next couple quarters will evolve into the overall structure in the next like 6 months or so.
Yeah.
And can you go over the primary, secondary, and tertiary one more time?
Yeah, so Peyton is actually writing down the
Oh,
scopes
he is,
now.
yeah.
I think that will be really helpful
okay.
to just maybe go through them one time. Also, one important thing to note is that ever since Rune started working on this stuff in public, it's been constantly changing, you know? So if you now go to the forum and you look up the scopes, then that's probably already out of date. So this is also an attempt to make like one kind of up-to-date overview. This is going to be your main point of reference. If you feel like you want to do more like studying Endgame and trying to understand it, I would suggest using this as a reference instead of the forum or whatever, because it's probably out of date anyway.
And if I'm being honest, I think if we dive into the 3 different levels and the 12 boxes, that may detract some of the people from the group. So let's go ahead and pause on that for just a minute.
Yeah, that's fine.
Can I ask a question? Are there parts that are more or less ossified than others? Like are some things kind of finalized and others are still in flux, or is everything in flux?
Yeah, so that's why we kept a lot of concepts out right now, because like this is the overall structure. If you think about it as a building, this is the steel frame and the floors are now defined, and now we're doing the floor plan and designing it and you know, putting in the fire escape, stuff like that.
Yeah,
but like this is the overall structure where you have your strategy layers, your connection between the strategy layer and the workforce, and how the strategy layer is actually enacted or improved upon. and then the overall workforce layer, or the core units as you know them today, evolving into these different layers. This is the most concrete thing that we'll have, and we're continuing to iterate on it, hopefully more collectively as a group as we progress through some of these smaller parts.
Yeah, I would say if I keep track of it, it's more ossified than not. It's like
Yeah.
fairly similar as it's described over the past few months.
Yeah, but an example of like the core unit concept and like the scopes evolving, those are some of the things within these larger structures that will continue to evolve as we play with them. But this has remained the most constant and what we spent the most time on discussing over the retreat.
And there's multiple names for the same thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Councils and tribunals are the same.
More or less. There's nuances to it where like a council can be a part of like 1 or 2 primaries, but tribunals have to be a part of all 8 secondary and tertiary scopes. But
Sure.
So why is the separation of how it is, like, what's the why do we separate councils and tribunals, and how do they interact with each other?
the highest level description for that is basically these are the expert groups that drive the revenue for the protocol or the overall investment, the majority of the capital spend.
Councils?
The primary scopes supported by the councils.
Okay, yeah.
And then the secondary and tertiary scopes, which are supported by tribunals, or more of your operational layer that you could have these generalists come in and maybe more DAO experts instead of like your capital, real world assets, or decentralized collateral experts. They focus on the product while these guys focus on the overall organization.
Okay.
Tribunals are like a light version of a council,
Okay.
but it's conceptually the same thing.
But scopes don't have people, right? That's more like a conceptual documentary level.
It's like the work to be done.
Yeah, so a scope is like your overall bucket, similar to like a core unit. The analogy may fall apart a little bit, but a core unit has a facilitator, it has a workforce, it has a budget.
So there's people.
It's not a direct link to people because again, like it's attempting to have this like balance of power structure where if somebody's bad, we're not entirely dependent on them. So councils and tribunals live within the governors, more or less. So then the DVCs ultimately mandate and drive the scopes. The councils and the tribunals are the ones working on the frameworks, which are defined by the scope structure. But a scope itself isn't dependent on a specific person. So it's this concept, this structure, kind of like a MIP.
Yeah, it's
right?
an abstract level, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's the MIP framework for strategy.
Yeah. Cool.
But the main difference right now is our MIPs are kind of like framework and execution, right? When we pass a MIP, we say, okay, we're doing this now. Whereas when we ratify a scope or amend a scope, it's saying, okay, these are the things that are allowed now. And then it abstracts that away from the work that's actually being done.
Yeah.
Because one problem we obviously have in Maker is you bundle a bunch of things together in a MIP. A lot of people like 75% of it, you pass it, and then you just kind of deal with the consequences. The idea here is that these are defining what will be allowed, and then what gets built on top of that is up to the individuals themselves. So hopefully it's in a way that kind of respects sovereignty a little bit more, and that you'll basically have the rules sheet here, and when you go to do the work, that's what you see to see if it's allowed. And like Retro was saying at the beginning, the top level is very big and very abstract and primarily has to do with like revenue, right? As you get further down the list, it's kind of nitty-gritty details.
Who checks if the work that the execution does is actually the work that was needed?
Yeah.
It delivers.
The framework defines how that should be done. The DVCs are the primary actors doing that. And then Governor DAOs come into play a little bit to that, depending on like how some of like the later stage RFP processes work. But it's again, it's a balance of power between like these two entities operating underneath this defined process to make sure that work is getting done.
So DVCs would need to have expertise in what the actual teams are doing.
Aren't those the councils and the tribunals that will do that?
Yeah, but again, like the councils are more of the workforce layer, where the DVCs are more of the MKR holder strategy layer.
Yeah. But my understanding is that all that kind of stuff happens by the councils and tribunals, because they are the ones that are like the subject matter experts for their particular.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, but the system's designed to have some sort of counterparty to keep everybody in check.
Yeah.
So like even if the governors are the ones primarily responsible, to Dennis's point, the DVCs are then the ones that are kind of like fact checking those.
Now, something Cruz said that I find interesting is that in the beginning, of course, there will be just one DVC, but the idea is to have then more than one DVC per scope to represent like different visions.
Political parties almost.
Yes, political parties. Remember that he had that idea?
I'm gonna keep.
It's still there.
I'm gonna keep shouting it, but I think it's on YouTube. The October 7th upload of the DVC meeting has a very clear description, one of the most clear of that dynamic. So I encourage everybody to power through that hour 20 to get a full appreciation of the vision behind that.
Cool. I suggest we now, so we looked at all of the core concepts that we need to acknowledge that they're there. Let's talk about something that's a bit more actionable and more tangible, and something that's actually going to affect us over the next 12 to 24 months, and that's like the implementation. So the way that we broke it down is using the phases, right? So Rune has been using this concept of phases. So we have pre-game, we have early game, mid game, and end game. The idea is basically that we're going to launch early game in about a year. That was Rune's ambition. I'm a bit skeptical because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's also the market conditions that you're kind of depending on. But let's just assume, okay, that's something that we want to do starting 2024. Early game launch actually means that we have those first MakerDAOs alive. And everything that we're doing before that, that's basically the phase we're currently in, that's called pre-game. So that's basically preparing for the launch of the MakerDAOs. And when it comes to pre-game, that's actually pretty well defined what needs to be done, right? So what are all the chunks of work that need to be completed before we can progress to that next phase? And there are these pre-game products, as Rune defined them. They're like individual, like deliverables that need to be finished. That basically MakerDAOs cannot exist without them being completed. So there's a bunch of those deliverables that are related to Maker Core. So we have the first version of EtherDAI v1, which is like a token wrapper for Lido staked ETH. Then we have Elixir, which is a balancer pool for Ether, DAI, and MKR. And then we have the Metanomics v1, so basically all of the contracts related to that. And then we have the MakerDAO deliverables, so MakerDAO token contracts, MakerDAO token farms, Meta Elixir, which is a Uniswap pool for the MakerDAO tokens and MKR. The MakerDAO front end or app v1, that's basically the interface that end users will use to participate in these farms and stuff. And then off-chain voting for the MakerDAOs themselves. And then there's also some things that are not captured in the pre-game products, but I think we should also define. So one I wrote down is delegated MKR farming, because that's quite complicated technically. Maker Core governance tweaks to make it compatible with this whole notion of DVCs and stuff. But there's probably more that we should add here. So that's something I'd like to ask you all to think with me. And then apart from the pre-game products, which are more like actionable, let's say, code that needs to be finished, let's look at the things related to the clusters that happens in the pre-game. So something that's relatively new and that I think Rune hasn't documented yet is this notion of pre-cluster lock-in and post-cluster lock-in. So the idea is that over the next, let's say, half a year or so, the clusters are kind of collaborating a lot still. So we're just collectively building a narrative about what MakerDAOs are about and what the whole, let's say what the narrative is behind this pivot. So that's very like outward focused. There's going to be a new forum that's going to launch focused on MakerDAOs, but it's not going to be focused on those clusters. It's just going to be one forum and everyone is going to be in there, and it's kind of where people that are interested in this whole thing can start figuring out which community do they want to be part of. Do I want to be like a creator? Do I want to join a creator MakerDAO or a protector MakerDAO? And this is also where like let's say the meta of each MakerDAO gets developed. So this all happens basically until probably the summer of next year. That's what's been mentioned before. And probably somewhere in the summer or just after the summer of next year, that's when we have the so-called cluster locking, and that's where each cluster launches their own forum and really starts engaging with their own community. So that's like, this has already developed some kind of mini communities and some kind of narratives for each cluster or for each MetaDAO. And then they're going to have their own forum, and then they're going to be really focused on those communities. And that's when you get more of some kind of competition. And this is where the MetaDAOs really prepare for launching their MetaDAO and doing like their token launch and that kind of stuff. And then we also have, there's also stuff that needs to be done related to DVCs that all needs to be bootstrapped. I didn't really define yet what that's going to look like because, yeah, that's something I think maybe we can ask the delegates, for example, if they have any thoughts there. But so what I would suggest now is that we, what I would like to see is we get some kind of mapping of the experts for each of these particular concepts, right? So, for example, I have been very, very deep thinking about this kind of stuff. So the MetaDAO front end and the app. So if there's anyone who wants to have any clarification, or if you have questions about that component, then you should probably talk to me and I can help you with that. But when it comes to, I don't know, let's say the metanomics, it might be Sam that you want to talk to, right? So
I'm not going to be, I have to go do it.
you're gonna go, okay, all good. we'll write your name down on where it makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so my question to you all is, there's a bunch of post-its there, there's like Sharpies and pens. If you feel very confident about your understanding of one of these, let's say, concepts or building blocks, just take a post-it, write your name on it, and add it to that particular thing. It can be to more things, of course, like if you feel like you get a good understanding of a few things, just put them down there. Yeah, let's do that now. Let's take like 10-15 minutes for that, and what we'll have as some kind of nice deliverable is we have like a map of where are the experts for each of these concepts, but also which concepts are generally like less understood, right? So what are the things that, if there's within this group, if no one feels confident taking ownership of that one in terms of being the expert, that's a red flag, and we should probably talk about that more, like collectively, and maybe talk with Ruin and see if we can.
Do you think it would be good to also do questions? So if something is fuzzy, write your name down with like a question mark, and then we can see within this room how we can organize experts and people who need more time on concepts to then pair up.
Yeah, but I think that happens automatically. Like if you have the experts defined, then people know where to go if you have questions.
Okay.
So we're right here. This is the scopes.
These are the scopes. These are what govern the strategy for the entire protocol, MetaDAOs, everything, ecosystem actors, whoever is trying to do work within the protocol, governed by scopes. You got primary, secondary, and tertiary. Pretty self-explanatory. Primary are going to be the most important ones who are directing most of our resources, hopefully going down from there. Now, who helps influence and set these scopes? I'm going to need to move over a little bit to frameworks. DVCs are decentralized voter committees. These are MKR holders, in theory, who are motivated for maker success. They're going to have their own beliefs that they're going to want to try to use to influence the scopes, but ultimately it'll be the delegates, who are somewhere, to vote for any changes through the scopes. Delegates themselves have to serve multiple DVCs if they want to get paid, which means they're listening to multiple different strategies. Basically people's opinions. They're trying to keep as many people happy as possible to retain voting power and be eligible for compensation. The DVCs have at least quarterly meetings for each of the scopes, and that's important because they have to decide, okay, well, we're the Dove Party, we really want to invest in growth, and if there's going to be growth, we need to actually like loosen some of these restrictive security restraints, for example. Maybe you don't want to do that. It's your DVC, not mine. But the point being that every quarter you need to meet to see, okay, are there any changes we could recommend within the DVCs that could help accomplish our goals? The experts will kind of debate. Eventually a proposal is made and the delegates vote it through.
Can you explain the Maker Core, how it remains the same, what parts remain the same?
So in theory, Maker Core is essentially just the scopes and the people constructing the omnibus spells. Omnibus spells are anything that needs to be incorporated from all the MakerDAOs. That's another change in the Endgame Plan, where no longer is it up to Maker Core to come up with the inclusion for spells. Instead, MakerDAOs will have to code anything they need. They'll have to submit it to Maker Core. It'll then be quality checked, make sure everything's okay, combined into one spell, and proposed to the delegates. So this is also, in theory, include any... actually, never mind. Forget I said anything there. Great. So Maker Core then is essentially just scopes, which are kind of like MIPS right now, with a few differences, but you can think of them as just the legislation that governs the protocol and the people making sure that technical level changes can happen. Everyone else is being abstracted towards MakerDAOs, which start with clusters. Cluster is just a group of people that want to work together to achieve a certain goal. Those people that are clustering are essentially putting themselves out there to be adapted by a MakerDAO. And MakerDAOs themselves consist of admins and contributor teams. Contributors are people who do things. Admins are ones that interact with the bureaucracy of Maker Core.
So originally you are only getting admin teams and then later on contributor teams.
Correct. It's basically you need admin teams to say, hey, here's who we are, what we stand for, what we'd like to work on. They would then interact with the scopes and say, okay, well, growth scope says that Maker needs to expand to Southeast Asia. So you get together a contributor team that says, hey, according to all the rules of the scopes, I have this really cool product that'll help us expand, I don't know if it's wand dye or something like that, but they've come up with this cool thing to interact with Asia.
And then can you walk us through the clusters going to become MakerDAOs?
Right, so there's only 3 different types of MakerDAOs: governors, protectors, and creators. Creators are ones that focus on decentralized collateral. So they are not offering any real-world assets deals, no kind of bespoke credit facilities. They're just focusing on offering decentralized collateral, working on their meta, and hopefully coming up with profitable ecosystems that don't rely on lending DAI against real-world assets. By contrast, protectors, who can still offer decentralized collateral, like creators can, they'll be focusing on these real-world assets. So that's credit facilities, that's wrapped Bitcoin even, stablecoin, PSMs. Protectors, if it involves the real world, you have to be a protector. And governors are essentially the people that help make sure the scopes have access to expert actors and have core unit teams that check the quality control of the MakerDAOs. So scopes set out a rule, governor DAOs have core units that then look at what the MakerDAOs are doing and make sure they all follow the rules. And if not, they would submit them to an arbitration panel.
This is all the pre-game, right, that we're going over here?
This is like pre-game to launch. And governors, at least right now, probably won't be there for launch because the main thing is we need to get these protectors and creators. The people that are currently working on the Maker protocol, GovAlpha, Risk, EE, they can kind of hang out in Maker Core with the understanding that once this system gets up and running, they'll be they will no longer exist within the core.
Let's move on to the pivot, which starts over here.
So that's essentially where we are right now, right? Bruno's passed the Endgame pre-launch MIP set, which has implied a whole bunch of work for the current MakerDAO to do. Of that is the POV, the protocol owned vault emulation.
Yep.
This is like probably the first product that really technically needs to be developed, which will allow Maker to purchase Lido staked ETH, borrow, as in mint new DAI against it, and buy more Lido staked ETH. So this is essentially a way for the protocol to borrow and lever up on liquid staked ETH. Once that's developed, we'll kind of split into two tracks. Be working on developing Ether DAI, which is just a wrapper for liquid stake derivatives, and developing the meta token contracts and their various components.
Let's take these names down so people don't think that these guys are like building this or something.
Yeah, these are people who thought they might be able to help answer questions on them. So if you do see them and you have questions,
Only pros' name can stay up here.
you can ask me about the POV, and if you get too technical, I'll direct you to one of the
Essentially,
engineers.
all of this here is being, it would be built out by protocol engineering.
Correct. And then once these kind of basics are fulfilled, remember Elixir is just a balancer pool of MKR DAI and Ether DAI. And then you go down into this next layer of contracts, which is MetaDAO token contracts. That's kind of related to MetaDAO tokenomics here. Also to token farms. So this is the idea that all MetaDAO emissions, they're going to emit a rate around 3.5%. I'm not sure if the number's been finalized yet. Of the meta token supply is going to be inflated each year to fund farms. Farms will be split into delegation, Ether DAI debt, and DAI staking. So that's about as high level as I can get there.
Yeah, the front end here is obviously built by Dennis, so we got that one right.
Yeah, and go ahead if you have a question.
Yeah, so the front end, can you give us a kind of a visualize of what it will look like?
Yeah, so the front end, basically every MetaDAO needs their own front end. And this is because they're going to be getting profit sharing. They need a place for their community to be able to access all these token farms that they actually own and maintain. But that front end is kind of going to be your everything front end. It's going to allow for delegation through the DVC to a delegate. It's going to allow for the DAI staking, and it's actually going to allow for decentralized collateral vaults as well. So you're going to be able to borrow against ETH and ETH liquid stake derivatives.
So it's three things. There's delegation, DAI staking, and vault staking.
Excellent, yep. And then reminder that in terms of the MetaDAO token farm, for the vaults, the only incentive is to borrow against ETH or liquid staked ETH derivatives. And that's kind of related to the POVE, the idea being that we want as much DAI as possible to be backed by decentralized collateral. So in contrast to centralized collateral, which can be rugged at any moment, it's theoretically impossible to rug ETH. So we want to be having that as our kind of flagship collateral that we mint DAI against.
But isn't leverage on ETH a potential risk if you have like larger swings in price?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea behind the protocol owned vault emulation is that the leverage rate is somewhat reasonable. It's not full degen 130% or something crazy like that. Mm-hmm. It's 225%. And then every month, at least, the risk score unit will be issuing reports suggesting what should be done with the amount of leverage in that protocol and vault emulation. So if the market starts to decline, maybe they say, hey, let's wind some stuff down. They could also at any point declare an emergency action. So boom, ETH drops 20%, and it looks like we're getting close to what we would liquidate a user on.
Yeah.
That's a great time for risk to jump in and say, okay, we need to take manual action.
But there's no automatic liquidation for our own vault.
Correct. There won't be any automatic liquidation because we're in charge and can always take action.
Okay.
And here we get a little bit more advanced, something called the cluster lock-in, which is hopefully targeted for Q2 of 2023. Kind of give us a breakdown. What does it mean, cluster lock-in?
So between now and then, we're already have this in-game Discord channel, right? We're going to spin up an in-game forum where people are going to start talking about clusters, meta, things that they want to stand for. And the idea is that by Q2 2023, we'll be ready to lock some clusters in. We'll be ready to say, okay, now it's time to spin up the, at this moment, 5 MetaDAO Discords and forums and draft our clusters into them. In practice, the clusters will actually need to be approved. But realistically, we should have enough time by the end of Q2 to say, okay, it seems like these people's values are aligned with this MetaDAO. So let's presume that they're going to go in. Let's launch the tokens, the MetaDAO token contracts, and let's allow the cluster to officially vote them in and make it official.
And then there's a post-cluster lock-in.
So this is like, all right, we know which clusters have been adapted to which MetaDAOs, and now they need to get to work, right? Presumably, right off the bat, they're not going to be able to make any money. They're going to be getting seed funding for legal expenses, for development, for hiring experts. Basically, things they need to bootstrap their community and their product offerings. The idea is there that by 2024, we shouldn't need this input of the current Maker core, but instead, these clusters will have become full MetaDAOs and able to stand on their own feet and allow the scope map, the DVCs, everything we talked about before, to fully govern their actions.
And that's a one-time funding, correct?
The seed funding is one time, and then every year there's going to be MKR emissions. So a certain amount, I believe it was 70,000 MKR at last update, is going to be minted by Maker Core and distributed to the MetaDAOs. And that is going to be distributed based on how much Elixir the MetaDAOs have been able to accumulate. So kind of pro rata, if you get 25% of all Elixir accumulated by MetaDAOs, you should get 25% of the emissions directed towards MetaDAOs.
Your MetaDAO, so it's competitive.
So it's competitive. The idea, right, remember, they've already been given their seed funding. They've been given 2 quarters to kind of get things up and going. So by the time of the next MKR emission, they should hopefully be generating revenue, which they are then using to buy Elixir or burn their own token. And you would want to accumulate as much Elixir as possible to a certain point, so you get more MKR emissions. And past that point, you would want to spend it on supporting your own MetaDAO token price.
So as we say in America, is swim or sink?
Yes, that is the first swim or swing point. Well, second really, because you have to find a place to be locked in and supported. But you haven't really had to deliver anything at that point, right? You've just talked about what your values are, which anyone can say they have good values. But once you're locked in, then you're on your own. If you don't perform, you don't have DAI to purchase Elixir, which means you're not getting emissions, you're not burning your own token. All the value that was seeded is essentially going to zero.
Got it. And let's finish it off here. You guys put up posted here DVCs, meaning there'll be a lot more DVCs involved, hopefully 2, 3, 4 years from now.
Right. Initially, right, Rune's been running his own DVC calls, invited others to do so. So far, they haven't really. So the assumption is that we'll probably have one main DVC at the start. But eventually, as people realize, oh, I get diluted if I'm not participating in the system. I should participate in the system, and if I'm already participating, well, I might as well contribute to the strategy layer.
Got it. Or form a DVC. Got it.
To do the strategy.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then these are some long-term goals.
Yeah, we. A, timing-wise is difficult, and B, just knowledge-wise, I don't think I can accurately tell you what is a part of all these.
Yeah.
But Rune has at various points through his forum posts laid out points he wants products to get. So if you recall back here, we were at Elixir V1. This was just a simple balancer pool. Eventually, right, we're going to be having our own Ether die because Maker Core itself could choose to stake ETH, receive the liquid stake tokens, and make that a part of Elixir. So early game, mid game, and in game are just various points of how far in development we should realistically be. Because we're starting out with bootstrapping. These will be solutions that are technically sound, but not philosophically ideal, right? Like, it would be great if instead of going to a balancer pool, we had our own pooling contract that worked for us, right? But balancer is safe and secure in our estimation, so they're a great place to help us launch in game, but won't be where we stay forever.
Terrific. This has been super informative. We had a great turnout today, so that also is a bonus, right?
Yeah, someone can ask Rune how many inaccuracies I gave, but I think it's quite low. I think that was a decent overview.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Peyton.